Morning, guys. This is Martin.
Morning, Martin.
Just to say, I'm staying until past. Looking forward. And I can see the session is being recorded. The comms team is very pleased.
Boris, do you want to test sharing your screen for your presentation? Boris, can you hear us?
Yeah. One moment. Klaus, how do I share my screen? I think you have to make me presenter.
You are presenter. So you now need to go to the third button. So you've got the green phone, the camera, and the TV screen. If you click the TV screen, your screen should show.
I don't have a TV screen button. I have a microphone, a camera, or a little box. There we go.
Ah, there we go.
Good. All right. Well, that means that I'm all ready.
I think we should probably give a few more minutes for everyone to join. Maybe I'll send around an email with the invite again.
We'll give it 2 more minutes to have people join, and then I'll go ahead and start. All right, I'm gonna start. Thanks for all being here. Klaus and I were thinking a while back of doing some webinars as a way for us to all get a bit more on the same page as to what we're doing and sort of what the larger ideas in SCORE are. This is the first one. Most of you will probably know me, but this is me. I'm Boris, and I, in SCORE, am the consortium open source development manager, but also I do a lot of other things. All my work kind of like is bundled around this idea of growing an open source ecosystem for cities. And that means that I'm working with Amsterdam to be an open source advisor, that I work with them to improve their way of working and the way that they think about the things that they make in order to make it more open source and to leverage the power of open source more, but also to be more part of a community. I also do similar work for some other cities in the Netherlands. And then together with Ben Cerveny, I'm director of the Foundation for Public Code, where we're actually trying to sort of create the infrastructural things that are missing right now that are needed in order to create an open source ecosystem for cities and to sort of create the next generation of digital transformation for cities. My role in SCORE is to help the entire consortium do open source things and to work open source where necessary. This means that if you have any questions about open source or about collaboration or about how to do transnational development, I can help you with that. And you're always free to let me know. just send me an email or post on the community in order to know something. So I'm going to give a presentation now on sort of the basics of open source, what it is, and what kind of place it can have in SCORE. I'm going to do that over the course of this hour, and not necessarily very linearly, but I'm going to going to go past sort of all the important bits, and then I hope that everyone can understand and remember things. During all of this, you feel free to ask questions. You can do that in the chat, and just post a question in the chat, and I'll try and get back to you. Or maybe you can just speak up. I think we're with few enough people that should be fine. And then I'll try to answer your question, or I'll hold it for later if it's something that I'm going to come to. And then at the end of this webinar, maybe there'll be some time for us to have a more in-depth conversation about what's happening with you and etc. So sort of a 50,000 feet overview of what I'm going to be talking about. Basically, open source is a form of open collaboration in which everyone has their own version and runs their own version, and they share improvements with each other. This means that it's not this sort of classical vendor-customer relationship, but it's more about a community of users and maintainers. This works very well for public institutions such as city governments or university, etc., in their digital transformation, because their activities are similar and they need control over their IT. In addition to that, they also don't have a lot of the sort of like competition reasons why companies might not be interested in open source. Open source is possible because there are there's a whole mature ecosystem of tools that include version control and licenses, specialized social media for collaboration that make it possible to work in an open source way. And there are many governments and public administrations and the like that are already using open source, contributing to existing open source things or building new open source things in sort of different ways. And I'll go over all these topics a bit more in depth during this this seminar, and then I hope that you will understand why I'm so crazy about open source and why I think it's so important. As I really think that open source is a crucial step in enabling cities to solve the scale of problems that they need to solve in the next coming decades. So this all starts with sort of what is open source? Important question. If we look at the Wikipedia page for what is open source, it says this. It says, the open source model is a decentralized software development model that encourages open collaboration. So in that, you see, this is about software. It's about making software. It's about being decentralized. So multiple actors can have control over what they're doing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a leader or a follower or these kinds of models, or a maker and a customer. And then it encourages open collaboration. And I think the open collaboration aspect of that is actually what, to me, is the sort of the secret weapon that open source is. So, well, open source is a collaboration form. It is a way of collaborating, and I think that is a very important thing in there, is that it's not the licenses or the tools or any of that. It is basically collaboration. And so the traditional model is where you have a vendor, someone who makes a piece of software, and you have a customer, someone who buys a piece of software. We see this in municipalities and cities and whatever other companies a lot, where there's someone who sells a piece of software and then you buy it. And basically what you buy is usually access to the software. So you buy the ability to be able to use the software from the vendor. You don't really buy the software, but you buy sort of the ability to use it. And in open source, this model is quite different. It is not. It is different because in open source, it is not really seen as being creating a consumer product or a customer product. It's more seen as your often open source projects start out with people solving their own problems, and then, sorry? No. Often open source projects start out with people solving their own problems and publishing the solution to their problem, and then trying to get other people to adopt their solution to the problem. And the reason why people would do that is because if you find users for your solution, it means that those users can then give you feedback on how they are, for instance, using your solution. And so if they give you feedback, they can become like an involved user, and you can make them part of your process, and give them the feeling that also they can be part of the process. You can help them by solving their problems, but also they can help you by finding sort of the flaws in your software, figuring out like what is wrong or in what circumstances it fails, where you might not always be able to test that. And this means that you get a lot more insight into your own software. And if you're critically dependent on it, that makes a lot of sense to have a lot of eyes on that software. Now, if your user has a bit more of an issue and they're interested in how the software works, they might look into the source code, and then where it used to be that they might have like find a bug or a feature that they wanna have incorporated. Now they could, for instance, look into the source code and say like, hey, like, I would love to have this feature, and you can really easily add it by, in your source code, adding this line of code, or saying, hey, I found a bug and it's located at this line in your source code. Like it crashes and it tells me that over on this line in your source code, that's where the problem is. And once they understand those kind of things, they might be able to contribute changes back, so they can become a contributor. And that's great, because then it's not up to you only anymore to maintain that source code. So it becomes advantageous to have people contribute like once or twice, but also to get them involved more, and to take sort of like co-ownership over the software. And that makes the software better, it makes it stronger, it makes it more reliable, it usually makes it cheaper to operate. And what makes that is basically a community. Like open source is not a traditional relationship between a vendor and a user, but it is a community of people that together maintain code that they're reliant on. So it's this community aspect is the most important thing that's there. I think this sort of like catches that to me, is that open source is usually users that develop their own solutions together. In open source, in order to use software, you need to be able to what is called build it yourself. And that means that normally if you buy software from the App Store or from the Mac App Store, the Windows App Store, you get what's called a binary. That's a file that gets onto your computer and that can run instantly because it's already in sort of like low-level machine code that your computer speaks. But if you are building software, you usually program it in a programming language that is more easy to understand for humans. And in order to run that on your computer, it needs to build specifically for your computer or for your architecture. Macs need different builds than Windows computers, than Linux computers, etc. And because you need to, if you're using open source, you often need to build it yourself. That means that you already get slightly more technical users involved. And so open source works really well for users that have a problem and that need a solution and that want to reuse other people's code there. And open source means open collaboration. But what is an open collaboration? What does it mean to work in the open and collaborate in the open? These are sort of the main points in that, and I'll come to why this is important later. But in an open collaboration, it is very important that everyone can view the source code, can view sort of what the basis of what you're building. These can be source code, it can be blueprints, it can be a recipe if you're making food. It can be any of those things. But everyone should be able to build their own version from that. Also, it's very important that everyone can follow along with the conversations that are had, the decisions that are being made in the development of the software. Because that is a requirement for them to, for instance, not only be involved in the community, but it's also a requirement for them to judge whether this code is right for them. If there's a software product and you're considering to use it, or you're considering to continue using it, and the conversations that are had around the software project very clearly indicate that it's going to a very different direction from what you need, then you know that it might not be for you, or that you might want to copy it and go do something else with it, or things like that. It's very important. And it's very important to know how you can contribute. Now, this differs a lot per project. And some projects are very open in that they say, well, everyone can make a pull request, and if we think that it's if the maintainers of this project think that it's good enough, then we'll merge it and we'll make it part of the source code. And other projects say, well, you can only contribute something if you sign this agreement with us, saying that we have the rights, the authorship rights to your contribution, and that we can do with it whatever we want, or these kind of things. And I think that's fine within a certain bandwidth. The important bit here is that it's clear for people that if they want to use your software, if they want to be part of your community, that they know how they can contribute. The same thing comes for governance. Like, who is the person who decides in this project what gets adopted? Who is the person in this project who decides where the community goes? This is also very, very broad. In open source, you have basically two main models. On one side, you have the Apache model, which is very free and open, and it is based on merit, in which people vote, in which the community votes for all the important decisions that are being made, and also the community votes on who can be part of that community and how that works. Whereas the other form for that is called, in open source world, BDFL, which is short for the Benevolent Dictator for Life model, in which there is usually one person who decides on everything, or one company who decides on everything. For instance, Google does this a lot in their open source projects. They stay in control, and they allow people to contribute, but they are the people who decide what works and what doesn't work, and what gets merged and what doesn't get merged. And it should be very important in an open collaboration, how you can be part of the community and what that sort of entails. So this starts with, for instance, having a very clear code of conduct is seen as something really important. A lot of open source contributors will probably not contribute to a project, to a larger project that doesn't have a code of conduct, because it is very important to know, if you're part of a community, how that community behaves and what it sort of tolerates in kinds of behavior, etc. And so it's very important to sort of set out the base rules for that. And because it's such an inherently social thing, what we see is that there are specialized social media for collaborating on open source software. And these are the two sort of most common ones. On the left is GitHub, and on the right is GitLab. And they both do almost the identical thing. They're also built on the same common core that is open source, called GitLib. And these two are basically like Facebook for collaborating on complex projects. And so they contain project management aspects of that, conversation aspects. You can have conversations about specific editions or about features or about bugs, and they allow you to sort of see who is contributing what and what kind of engagement there is, etc. On the bottom of this is a different way of doing version control. And sort of the traditional way of doing version control is the linear version control. So at one point you can create a document, you can edit that document, then you send it to someone else, that person can edit the document, that person can send it back, then you can edit this document, then you can send it over and through, and that works quite well as long as you're with a small amount of people, and if you also know who has like the current version and who's working on it right now. If you send it to a lot of people and they all edit it at the same time and then all send it back, merging those versions becomes really difficult. A solution for that would be to work in, for instance, Google Docs. Google Docs allows you to work with many people in the same document at the same time and make edits to that document. But it will also mean that if you're coming in there, there will be a lot of like half-finished things. People might be editing the same bit. They might be editing the same bit and have different ideas of where it should be going. So for really large-scale collaborations, and especially if you have the requirement, for instance, for it to be software that is able to run, which means that it can't have any half-finished things in it, open source usually uses version control, which is based on branching. And the idea of branching is that there's a main version, and then in order to make any change, people copy the main version, they make their edits, and then they propose to make those merges back into the main version. And in that model, because the merge is the moment that you can talk about it and choose what to merge and what not, the conversation becomes about those merges, about when you merge what back. And this is a way of version control that you can, it doesn't really matter whether you're working with 2 people on something or whether you're working with 1,000 people on something. Although it definitely, for working together with a smaller amount of people, usually it costs a lot of energy. And if you have if you work with a small enough amount of people that you can keep them all in your mind and know where they all are, then often Google Docs is a lot easier way to deal with these kind of things. So, free and open software licenses. Fairly often when people talk about open source, they mainly think about this aspect of open source. The licenses that open source comes with is in one way defining, and in another way I think also not that important and almost arbitrary. Because I don't think that it's the license which makes open source open source. However, it is a very important tool in building open source. And it's also a way in which we can discriminate between open source projects and non-open source projects, because it's a certain baseline that it sets. The Open Source Initiative, which is a foundation that basically they only do two things. The first thing they do is they maintain the sort of officially accepted definition of open source. And the other thing that they do is they review licenses to see if they fit that definition. And so on their website, there's a list of licenses that they have approved. And if you're looking for a license to use and it's not on there, then you're safe to say that it's not open source. An open source license is characterized by it's based on copyright, and it's based on the idea that an author is able to tell other people how to use their intellectual property. And basically you make a contract with the user, and in that contract you say that with my copyright I grant you the rights to use the code, to change the code for your own uses, and to redistribute this code, but also to redistribute the changes that you have made to the code. And also it says that if you use this code, that comes with no warranty whatsoever, and you can't hold me liable for anything. So if you're using my source code, it's on your watch. Like basically I am sharing this information with you, but you're responsible for running it, for executing it. And usually open source licenses say things about how you can use the trademarks that are related to the software. For instance, the name, how you may use the software name. For instance, you cannot, if you're using a software package called Apache Spark, you're not allowed to call your company Apache Spark if you use it, but you're allowed to say powered by Apache Spark. And then there's a thing that is important to realize, as a lot of more political agents in the open source field might talk about free software. And free software, for instance, Barcelona, the way that they talk in their digital ethics things, they talk about free software. And Barcelona says, well, we use free software and open source interchangeably. But the difference between free software and open source is the idea that free software should also, like, you are the owner also of the environment that you run it in, and it goes a bit further. But basically, if people say free software, or they say open source software, or they say Libre software, it usually means the same thing. And if you choose a license, if you want to choose a license for a project, there's this great website called choosealicense.com, which is also made partly by GitHub with a lot of other collaborators. And they have some great guidance on what license to choose. So why do companies use open source? Often this is because they have important software that they're running themselves, and because it's so important that it runs well, they have a lot of benefit in figuring out, like, what are the edge cases, what are the things that we might not have run into yet, but that could happen if we buy a different brand of hardware or something like that. And by getting their own mission critical software running on other people's machines, you sort of figure out more quickly what the problems can be. That also means that those people can then bring back community improvements to you, and that makes your software even better. So marketing, there's a lot of companies that build open source and that contribute to open source because they have, for instance, a services model in which they implement open source software for people, or they give consulting around certain open source packages. And you see this is in the open source universe quite a common business model, to have an open source package that you're developing, for instance, developing a database, and then next to that providing premium features, which could be service features, or they could be closer software that can be used with that database to make it work better, those kind of things. And then using open source really as a way to get out to people, to build a community, and to get people to use your things. Often we see that open source is used as a way of non-competitive collaboration. So Microsoft has large data centers, Google has large data centers, Amazon has large data centers, and they are all like, they all have one problem which is very similar, mainly that people want their service to stay up all the time and working. So what they do is they collaborate on those pieces of infrastructure which don't differentiate them from each other, so not their unique selling points, but what is the thing that they all share, and they don't have any interest of being better than the others in that particular thing, and so they work on that together. They work together on the infrastructure to provision the sort of baseline things. And because it's an open collaboration, because they are just publishing their things and allowing everyone to contribute to their project, or they're working together on that, it means that it's not a part of the, it's not, they're not forming monopolies, or they can still do this within the antitrust rules. You see this, yeah, almost every major tech company does this in some way. Working with open source means that you don't have a vendor lock-in. So if you are a large company and you're dependent on something for your mission, and it's mission critical, it is the infrastructure on which your organization runs, being dependent on one particular vendor might be a big problem, because it means that they might fall over, or they might change the way that they work, or they might change their pricing. I know of multiple cases in which governments were dependent on vendors for some crucial software and weren't able to switch software fast enough, and had to do new tenders and ended up paying a lot of more money because those software vendors decided to ask a way larger markup. Open source is often easier to support. There's often a lot of documentation on the internet. There's often a lot of people to find on the internet. There might be local software developers that might come in and help you with what you're doing, who are able to support it. And again, this also means if you don't have that vendor lock-in, then it means you can hire anyone for support. If a vendor might not be able to give support within the right time frame, you can ask another vendor to give that support. And last but not least, the issue of licensing. So with commercial software, there are issues with, they come with certain licenses. Those licenses might expire. They might be incompatible with other licenses that you have in-house. And it's kind of hard to understand because the licenses are all very particular to one piece of software. And one of the advantages of open source only having basically this reduced set of licenses that are accepted by everyone, by the entire community as being open source licenses, means that people know what they mean, and they know legally what that's going to entail. So it means that if you want to use a piece of software, you don't need to go to the legal department first and ask them like, hey, can we use this software under this license? But you can just go and use it. It saves a lot of time. So you are all using open source right now. There's not a question about it. Almost every computer, I dare not say, I think probably every computer is running, that is running some open source. If you're using the Chrome browser right now, Chrome is built on an open source project called Chromium, which is run by Google mostly, but it is open source. You can also download the Chromium browser, which is the Chrome browser minus the Google's added features. And it's basically open source so that others can look into its development and sort of contribute into it. But also important parts from that Chromium browser have been taken and are now other important open source projects. For instance, if you're using the Slack client, Slack is built on Chromium. It is basically Chromium with which can only open Slack. Linux is an operating system that almost every server in the world runs on. So again, if you're using the internet right now, chances are that you're using Linux. And also, if you have an Android phone, Android is basically, it's built on top of Linux, and it is also open source. It's also controlled by Google. Apache web browser, web servers, the most common web server. Almost every web server is open source. Apache is just the most common one. Kubernetes, OpenSSL are parts that are sort of at the baseline infrastructure of the internet as well. About how computers talk to each other. Open source. OpenSSL is the little green lock that you see in your browser bar when you go to a bank website. That is powered by OpenSSL, the communication that happens with your browser. LibreOffice is quite well known. It is basically a Microsoft Office alternative that is open source. Discourse, which is the software that the SCORE community runs on, is open source, and is also a fairly interesting open source project. And then .NET, which is Microsoft's framework for developing applications on Windows, is also open source. So while Windows is not open source, and the applications that are built on Windows are also maybe not open source, the framework that they give developers in order to help them develop software is open source, because it is so important for developers to really be able to also understand what they're building and why they're building it on that. Open source is also used for a whole bunch of other things. There's a lot of open hardware devices, and these range from little programmable computers that you can use to switch on your lights, to the Fairphone, for instance, which is a phone which is open source. There's open source buildings, and there's open source fashion. I was talking 2 weeks ago with people from the Waag Fashion Lab in Amsterdam that are trying to build that are written by communities. So I want to remind everyone that if there are any questions or something, that feel free to ask them in the chat or by speaking up, and then I'll continue, and I'll continue talking a bit more about like open source for cities specifically. So why is open source a good idea for cities? One is that for a lot of the organizations in cities, whether it be the organizations that are dealing with urban things, so those are all the organizations that are looking at urban things, whether they are governments or knowledge institutions or other things. Often what distinguishes them is where they are and the area that they're in and what they're doing. But they also have a lot of things which are similar. So a lot of them deal with geodata. They might want to do things with open data. Governments might have base registrations and policies to deal with. Then there are also just organizations, so they have things like business rules and dashboards. Information models might be very important for sharing information between organizations. This is something that they all share. And then also, and this is where I think this is a lot more important probably for governments and universities specifically, is they have a certain task and they're meant to follow that, to do that task themselves, and they're always going to be responsible. So even if a government hires a private software vendor in order to deliver its software to them or to provide a service for them, they are always going to be responsible. Like there's no way in which they can say, oh, it's just that vendor. No, they are always going to be responsible. And so keeping control over that process and being able to be the master of their own faith, basically, is super important. This means they should not be dependent on a vendor. They should always be able to change what is happening. So for instance, in London, Shadi Khan was elected partly on the platform of the Hopper Fair. And the Hopper Fair was this idea of, if you check into a bus once, then you should always be able to change buses within an hour, in order to make it possible for poorer people to take more complex bus routes. And so he was elected, and he went to TfL, the traffic agency who runs the buses, who operates the buses. And TfL is basically the only part of the whole London system which is really under control of the mayor. And he said to TfL, hey, I want to do this Hopper Fair. People should be able to change buses as much as they want within 1 hour of checking in with their Oyster card. And TfL said, all right, we're going to try that. And they went away, and they came back half a year later, and they said, well, we've only been able to make it possible to switch once in an hour, because the software that's in the buses, in the ticketing machines, we can only get our vendor to change it in that way and not in any other way. And so in that situation, it's been really the software which has been deciding the policy for the mayor, that the mayor is able to implement. So this is really important. Then it's also really important to know for public organizations what they're running and what's happening with their data. They're often bound by law to know what's happening in their organizations and what's happening with their data, to make sure that things cannot be copied or stolen. They should also always have access to their own data, which is quite important, which is sometimes not granted by vendors. I've heard of cases in which database vendors didn't allow access to the data in certain ways because it didn't fit an app that they had sold to someone else. And then last, I think it's really important, and something that is often overlooked, is that transparency is quite important in these kind of organizations, and being able to explain what is happening. And in that, I think a lot of the ways of working that are associated with open source are important, but it goes even deeper than that. I think it goes beyond what happens in open source. Government should really think about, like, how do we share the workings of RIT, if it's making decisions about people, to people themselves as well. Article 22 of the GDPR says that if there are automated decisions made about people, that people should be able to know what those decisions are based on. And so that means that if you're in Europe and you log on to some government website, and the government website tells you, oh, sorry, you can't get a parking permit, then you have the right to know why that is and to look into that process. And with software, that might mean being able to look into the source code. So what are the challenges? And the next bit is a bit more about city governments specifically, and I think it also, a lot of it also applies to a lot of other organizations. But But I kind of wanted to talk about these issues because I think it's important for us to have a shared understanding of what these kind of issues are. The first is this, what I often hear is, we are not a software company. Even though a lot of governments have always been organizations that are about information management and about dealing with information, often they don't see themselves in that way. And they don't identify information technology as a core business of theirs. They often think more about what they're doing on a service level or what they're doing on a policy level, and they don't understand that IT is a part of that. And so they're very hesitant to think about, like, oh, we should be developing something ourselves. And they often think about, oh, let's just have vendors that know how to make software, make the software, and then we can just buy it, and we are not responsible for that. But it doesn't really work like that, because a lot of software is deeply involved with the policy that you have, with laws that exist out there in the greater European Union, or with local laws, with national laws, and your software is a bit entangled with that. You could even say that if you have software which makes decisions about people, or that informs the city council to make decisions in a certain way, that software is policy in its own right, because it's a set of rules which has implications on people and tells people what they can and cannot do. And so government software and public software is often a mix of laws and policy and computer code, all mixed together without really being able to clearly decipher this. And this is what we in the Foundation for Public Code call code, because it's all code. Like, laws are code, policy is code, source code is code, and it's really important to also realize that and to think about that in this way. Then another problem I often see is I understand this thinking, but it's also very, very hard to effectively and easily share solutions in this way. So this makes it really hard to document things well. It makes it hard to make things about a community, because, like, how easy is it to build a community if everyone's required to put in money and to sign a whole bunch of contracts before they're allowed to join the conversation? It's really hard to reuse things. It's really hard to make things sustainable. Can you still hear me, everyone? Good. All right. Then I'll continue. And remember, if there's any questions, feel free to ask them. So another problem that I often see is it is too costly to send developers to that, but I'll go. So this is something which I often encounter. It's directors who say, well, they're having like bilateral communication. Let's not send any new developers because they should be developing things. I'll go to that, and then you end up with the wrong people in the room often. And this comes because these organizations are very hierarchical organizations. And these hierarchical organizations often run on the belief that the developers who are building software are people that are only executing, only people that are doing their thing, and that you can just tell them what to do and they'll do exactly that. They're seen as executing people. They're almost seen as like, they're seen in the same vein that a garbage man, you can give them a garbage truck and instructions on where to go, and then they'll pick up all the garbage bags along the route. And so, but they're not seen as the experts in their field that they really are. And often I see that developers are given policy and told like, okay, go implement this, but the policy is often not really coherent enough and formulated in the same way that in a precise enough way that you can build software from that. So developers need to build that software themselves and sort of use their own expertise in that. But these developers are never allowed to talk to each other because the directors will always be like, no, I'll go have that conversation. And this is a universal problem. And I think also in SCORE, this is also a problem. Then we have this, what I call context matryoshkas. And this is something which is also, I think, universal to any organization that does this, is that they say, well, this is totally specific to our organization. Like, we're the only city in the world that does X, or that has Y, or that does Y while X is doing Z. And this often stems from that cities can often see provincial governments and national governments and supranational governments, but cities don't easily see the next city over. So Amsterdam understands the context of being in the Netherlands quite well and being in Europe quite well, but Amsterdam doesn't necessarily understand a lot of what they share with another city in the Netherlands, like Rotterdam, really well. And then Rotterdam is very similar to the Netherlands in what they need to do. But because of this only being able to look upwards, it becomes hard to share things. Especially if we're looking at not Amsterdam and Rotterdam, because these people might sometimes be at the same party and then be able to talk about something and then understand that, hey, we're just talking different jargon, but we actually have the same kind of problems. Amsterdam definitely knows almost nothing about Bogota, or while in Bogota, they're doing vastly the same things that they're doing in Amsterdam. So this makes it really hard to share things. And also because we write things differently. For instance, the word public administration, which is quite a generalized word, I would say already. I know that in the United States, there's no definition for public administration, legal definition. And it means something different in almost every state. The definition of it is different in almost every state, but also there are a few states where within the state it has different definitions. And if you don't have those kind of definitions standardized, it is really hard to even realize that you're talking about the same problems. And being within, like, a government has to deal with only one legality and one sort of area. And that means that when you make abbreviations, for instance, for internal use, it's hard to realize how specific they are for your own organization. It's hard to realize that you're not actually talking about something general, but that you're talking about something which only happens in your organization. The not invented here syndrome is probably something that everyone knows. What I often hear people say when they're talking about, even about open source projects, is we've made this ourselves, leading to huge savings. And although I think that this is a really strong case for business things, and it's often a great way to incite organizational change. Reusing things is really, really important. And if there's something which is good, which can be reused, or something which is reusable and that can be improved together, often that means that it leads to even huger savings and to even better things. However, that's sort of the ego aspect of being the author is really important in highly political organizations. And this idea of like, look at me, I'm the first one to change something is really important. And that makes it really hard sometimes to reuse the sort of the core elements that we need to reuse. This is seen less in, for instance, very specific and very technical things, because those very specific and very technical things are usually not things that managers talk about. And it's things that are used on a broader basis. So a small city IT department, if they would be installing their own server, they wouldn't be thinking about writing their own operating system. They would just use Linux or something because it is already there and because it's already sort of like given. Now, what tools can we use? These are it's just a general overview of what kinds of things we can do in order to make these things work a bit better. One is open collaboration. So make sure people can always be part of a conversation, make sure conversations are always documented, make sure that decisions are always documented, people understand where decisions come from. Have conversations that you're having always in the public. And then make sure to be responsive in the community. And this can really help the project go viral and get word of mouth going, which I think is something which works great. Make it really easy for people to reuse what you're doing. Even if you think that it's super specific to your case, even if you think like, oh, but this is only about what's happening in this area, try and write it in English. Try and figure out like, is there a community that I can connect to and tweak it to be directed at them. And make sure that your documentation is always complete. I think a lot of open source projects, if you have great documentation and a shitty product, is usually not that much of a problem, but having a great product and shitty documentation, no one will ever use what you're having. So that really reminds that documentation is super crucial and that you have everything documented. Having things open from the start is something which I think is really important, because it makes sure that you don't fall into the pitfalls of closed source development and that you don't take shortcuts that might hurt your project later on. But it also means that people who are new to your project can see its origins and thus understand why the community is like it is, or if that software is really for them, if it really works for them. So publish from the first moment that you are working on something. Avoid very large changes and have conversations about small changes. Get people to document their process. Get people to document why they do things. Git really allows for you to, with every change you make, to clearly document why. And I find that this is really important, especially if you're still maintaining something in 10 years. And use public testing infrastructure. Have good architecture in which you use components and microservices. So don't build large monolithic applications, but build bits that you can piece together. This means that smaller pieces of what you're building can be reused also in different contexts. And it means that people can edit and apply it for their own use cases better. An open governance. Make clear to people what the project is, where it is going, who is in control, how the power is distributed, if you're doing voting, if it's possible for people to become part of the leadership, to make decisions in that. And yeah, try to get different people involved into that process that can be part of this. Greater diversity usually means that you can make greater software. Community and events. So getting your coders to go to other events where other coders are that are also dealing with these kind of things is great. I'm hoping that there will be more coding conferences in Europe soon. Now that's not that much. The Code for All Summit is next month, which I think is a great conference. FOSDEM every February in Brussels is great. ISA2 from the European Union puts on some great conferences. And there's networks for public coders in Germany, in the Netherlands. There's Code for Europe. There's a lot going on. And then Klaus can probably tell you way more about this. But if you procure things, you can make procurements in a way that they use open source software. And what you usually do is you procure developers to do work. For instance, implementing an existing piece of open source software in your organization, or building a new piece of open source software. And you don't pay for a license to use that. This means that you can have an open collaboration from the start. It means that you're not as reliant from that vendor, so you can use local vendors, you can use smaller vendors, you could use freelancers to do part of that work. And it's quite a great way to build that. Barcelona has done some great work on detailing how you could make this work, and they're publishing that on their website in a few weeks. Also in Amsterdam, we're thinking about this. And I would love to separately talk with you about this if you have any questions about it. Standards. So use good standards, using standards for your information models. There are standards for almost everything. And you don't need to use standards for every single part of your application, but if you make sure that the input and the output of your application at least adheres to some largely used standards, it means that it becomes a lot easier to develop things and to develop things with others as well. All right. If still feel quickly walk through one of these processes or the sort of all the steps that are in the open source development process and I hope that then it will become a bit more lively in your minds. And I can tell you a bit more about that. So every open source project starts with coding, starts with starting a project. So all open source projects start with coding something, and usually you try and publish that as quickly as possible. So for instance, the University of Amsterdam makes a pedestrian traffic flow model and that they've built and they've tweaked, and they've made a very primal first version. It's very basic, and then they publish it. And so they publish this code with the instructions on how to make it work on your system, and they publish it with the documentation so people can understand what's happening, and they can understand how to change it, they can understand how to use it in different scenarios. And it's published with a license. So these licenses are the open source licenses I talked about that are free to use. All the software is free to use. You can change other things, and sometimes it means that if you change something, you have to release it under the same license. The great website for this is chooselicense.com, where there's a little screenshot here, and that really helps you sort of like walk through that process of which license do I want. The University of Amsterdam shares their code online on GitHub. this social media for sharing open source projects, and then someone else can use it. A user can take that code, they can build it for themselves, they can configure it to work in their situation, and then they can report issues that they have back to the original author, who can then improve their thing. And now, what if Bradford City Council, so they use this, and but they want to make a change to it. Bradford City Council wants to take the software from Amsterdam, and they're already using it, and now they want to change a thing of it. So they take the entire source code, and they make a copy of it. And this can also be done on GitHub. And there, they can make a copy of it, and they can make their changes. And then they can use their own version and sort of to help to solve their own problems. And when they've done that, they can go back to the University of Amsterdam and say, like, hey, we've made these changes. We've added a cycling traffic simulation to your model. And now maybe you can use that. So the process of doing this, it's called a pull request. And a pull request is when you propose changes. If you propose a patch, it's called, to the original. It's, I've made these changes, and now I'm giving them back to the original source. Bringing it back to the original source is also why some people call it upstreaming. And that gets reviewed by the maintainer and the community, and everyone can look at what has been proposed, and everyone in the community can talk about this and talk about, like, if they like it or not. And then new versions can then be merged. The changes can be merged into the main version, and then everyone who uses the main version can use all the new things that have been added. So in this case, everyone could use the cycling model as well as the pedestrian model that was originally in there. So this is really illustrates sort of how the community works, and how a user can get involved and can become a contributor, and can then become a part of that. But what if you have an idea of, like, hey, I like this idea of these simulations, but I want to use it for something radically different from traffic or cycling. I want to use it for something completely different. Then you might think, like, okay, maybe we want to make this into a new project. So we want to copy this, and we want to go into a completely different direction. And we don't need any of the original community for that. We can make a new community and build those new things. This is called a fork. This is called a product or a community fork. It's when you're going a different way. And this can be great if you're doing something very specific. But sometimes forks are caused because communities fall apart. For instance, there is harassment in the community, or the community disagrees with the leadership. Then you can also have a fork, and those should be avoided, obviously. So, for instance, if Digipolis Gent would like to convert the code to a warehouse logistics system, and they can start a new project fork where they make it into something very different. An important concept to grasp also here is that these are often not entire applications, but they're often things that get developed in this way are bits of software that can be combined to an application. And if you have an application, and then all the bits of software that it's relying on, and all the bits of software that those bits of software are relying on, is called together, is called the dependency graph. And so these things are all dependencies. Usually when you're building software, you're building dependencies that people can use inside of their software. So you basically wrap the abstraction of a certain functionality of code into something that other people can use independently. And this makes it a sort of web of code that you can use. So when the city of Bergen builds a traffic management system that uses the University of Amsterdam's pedestrian and now also cycling model, then they're using that as a dependency. They're using the models as a dependency for their traffic management system. We're nearing the end of our webinar, and so I'm really quickly I can skip through these, or I can go through these existing cases that there are, or you can send me a question and I can answer those. But just as some examples, OpenMairie is a French software product, which is about managing basically anything that you have in a city. They have software for managing libraries, for managing city hall, for managing elections, dealing with citizens, managing graveyards, all these kind of assets. And it's built by the Association of small French municipalities. They have a lot of really small ones. And it's been going now for, I think, 10 years or 15 years or something, and it's quite powerful. API Umbrella is API management software by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. In the US, a lot of governments are building open source software. Like CCAN, which is the common data catalog platform that we see. Most open data platforms are based on CCAN. In Denmark, you have OS2 Loop and OS2 Forms and OS2 Web that are all sort of like basic things for governments, for local governments. And OS2 is the association of, one of the association of Danish municipalities, in which about half of the municipalities are there. Open Fisca is quite interesting. It is a fiscal model that has all of the fiscal legislation in France in it, so that if you want to propose new legislation or you want to figure out what, for instance, the universal basic income would do in France, you can just put it into that model and then it works. And also new models have been contributed about from Tunisia and Senegal, so you can also use Open Fisca to try out things in that case. The UNO Rijkshuisstijlcomponenten is a library by one of the parts of the Dutch national government that were getting so irritated at the design that they had to follow, that they were like, oh, let's just build the components for design, and then everyone can use the same components in their app, and they will all look the same. And they've done that quite well. Linux is maybe the most infamous open source in government project from Munich. It's their own Linux distribution that they had in Munich. And they've been running it for about 10 years. And they tried to get Windows out of the local public administration. But due to hardware issues, they weren't, with some departments, they weren't able to do that. And so there was always some Windows. Also, they made a fork of Linux. They made their own version, basically, which meant that they needed to do a lot of maintenance on it, which cost a lot of work. And now, after 10 years, the new government, which is very different and wants to be very different, decided to get rid of Linux. And they have allotted a large amount of money to transition back to Windows. They've allotted more money. I think they've allotted about 3 times more money to move back to Windows than they spend in the last 10 years on maintaining the Linux operating system. But it's a well-known thing. And gov.uk and most UK government services are also all developed in open source. And they're not necessarily doing that because it gets reused, but they're more doing that for internal reasons, because it means that internal departments can communicate with each other more easily, and because they want to be transparent and open to their citizens. All right, so to round everything up, a short overview again. So open source is an open collaboration in which everyone has their own version, but they can share improvements with each other. There's not a traditional relationship between a vendor and a consumer, but there's a community of users and maintainers. They it really works well for cities to do open source because their activities are similar and they need more control over their IT than they have. It's enabled by an ecosystem of tools such as version control, licenses, social media, and procurement, other things. And many governments are already using or contributing to open source software in some way. So if there's any questions still, I would love to answer them. Let's see, I'll answer them. All right. So Tim van Achten asks, he says he's in a very crowded office, but he has a small question. What are some best practices you can share to maintain open source communities? I think in this, I think it's really important to be very aware of the fact that you're a community, and it should be a group of people that are also a group of people with a common goal, but that also share a social structure with each other. So try and make it fun for everyone. I think it's very important to make sure to have some FaceTime with people. If you're not able to go to the bar together or to come together once in a while, it's good to have video calls to get face to face. And also it's great to, when you're going to conferences where other developers might be, to find the developers that might have done something with you and get together and hang out a bit. So that is an important one. Next question, what is in it for voluntary open source coders? This differs greatly. I think that there are, on the one end, there are a lot of open source coders that are working for a company that are, you would almost call them involuntary open source coders, maybe in your question. But they're working in a company. So what that means is that their company has made a strategic decision to use a certain bit of software, and in order to make sure that they are able to use it effectively, they also want to do some development on that. So they'll be working on that. Or they're so dependent on it that they're actually driving the development for a project like that. And because if you diverge from the main version and you never put your changes back into the main version, it means that it also becomes increasingly difficult to merge the main version with your version. So there's actually incentive there for people to put their work that they've done in changing things back into the main version, because it also means that they can have benefits from all the changes that other people have made. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's people who are doing it because they're interested, because they are personally interested in something. A lot of developers love challenges, they love changing the world, and there might be open source projects that connect to them in that way. And there's a lot of open source developers that are like amateur in the French sense, of like to do it because you love it. What are the best practices about how to also include developers in companies and organizations who can work on projects not only in free time, but also in company time? So in this, I think it's important that organizations that are using specific pieces of software also realize with what cost that comes, and that actually having developers inside of your organization that are in it and that are able to be involved with the development and then are able to understand the software might be a lot cheaper than to buy something from a third party, or than to run the risk of it failing and you not understanding how to fix it. So I think that's a big part of that. It's also by having those people, by having the community managers in-house, it means that you have access to a lot more of the development resources. Someone who is a developer on an open source project and you're using the open source project, if you have access to those core developers, it also means that they also have access to that community, and you can really, you get the most value from your work. Next question is, with open source, there's a shift from buying software to constantly developing software. How are your experiences in SCORE, and how are governments responding to this? I think this is a big change. I think this is an interesting change also because it has a lot to do with the sort of transition of the digital setting that we're going through right now. I think that has more to do with the impact of IT on companies. So for instance, in banks, you've already seen that banks have fired like 90% of their people and hired all the good programmers they could find, because they found out that actually they are process companies, they are IT companies. And that is their core business, is to do that. And that means constantly developing software. And for governments, I think that change is going to be very different, because in governments, we don't want to fire, I think, 90% of the people in order to make it work. And so we're going to also need to think different about these communities and about how we build communities around software that don't only involve people that are technical, that are able to do the programming, but also other kinds of people. And I think so that is an important thing in that. So next question is how to prevent governments to do double work. Is there a database of existing open source solutions? There are some efforts to make databases for open source solutions. Clarity is one, for instance, that is based on use cases. Team Digitale Italia, I've worked with them in order to make a metadata standard for open source projects so they could be more easily shared, which they've actually made part of their policy for all administrations in Italy to use. But this is still kind of hard to find. I also find that it's kind of a hard thing to figure out, because a lot of these problems might be quite slightly different, and what the space really misses is, I think, not databases, but I think what we're really missing is community. What we're really missing is the public coder conferences where we can come together and then talk with each other about, like, hey, this works well and this doesn't work well. And that's really, I think, the way that the rest of open source works quite well. Peter Jan is saying that well, I'm just going to continue on here with the questions. One moment. So what if an open source solution gets adapted for 3 cities? How do you strike the balance between what should be in common and what should be particular? I think this is a very, very good question. And in the end, I think that this is up to a particular community to decide what is best for their software. This depends, and it also kind of depends on your architecture that you have, and then you're using your software for. This should not be something which is very weird to software developers to understand, because this is core to what their practice is. Usually, I would say try to build your software so that you can have as many users as possible, because more users means better software in open source. More users, more contributors means better projects. So whatever you can do to get more users, go do it. Then Johan posted a link to the OGP toolbox and to Clarity, which are databases for projects. Also, JoinUp has the Open Source Observatory has a list with open source software that can be reused. OGP Toolbox has a list, and Johan says that he is planning on continuing developing that from next month on. At which Peter Jan says, "Great," and I think "great" is a great end to end this webinar. I would love comments and etc. if you have something to say to me about that. Or if you have any questions, you can email me at this email address, or call me at this phone number, or tweet me at this Twitter handle. Yeah, I would love to hear what you think of this presentation, what we could do better in the next webinars that we're going to have in SCORE. I hope that it's been useful for you. And I would also urge you to reuse whatever I've created in this, and please let me know. Oh, I'll post a link to, I'll email a link to the presentation to everyone in the invite, and then you will get them. And yes, they will also be on the community and in the share drive.